Hello everyone, this is Alan Brooks and welcome to another New Discovery teaching. Today we're going to be looking at a secret story in Ezekiel chapters 7 through 11. The last teaching I did was, amazingly enough, about a secret story in Isaiah chapters 7 through 11. It just hit me now that they're the same chapters. And basically, what did you find, Alan? Are you all that you found stuff that nobody's seen all this time? Well, what I did is I actually read these chapters instead of just scanned them. I actually read what they said, and they have a secret story. Isaiah 7 through 11's secret story is that Emmanuel will be born of a virgin, but at the end of time, God will send an Assyrian Antichrist against his land. And Isaiah 8:8, and then Isaiah 8:21 says, after this Antichrist has ruled for 3.5 years, not said there, but we know will happen, then the land will be darkness and distress, will be in darkness and distress. Well, that last 3.5 years is the greatest time of distress the world has ever known, and the land will be in darkness, as the sun, moon, and stars are darkened when Jesus Christ comes back. And the people at the end of Isaiah 8:21, the verse says, they'll look at the land and see darkness and distress and gloom, and they'll look up and curse at God. And that makes sense. Muslims hate Jesus. If they looked up and saw Jesus coming back in the midst of darkness, they would curse at him. Then Isaiah 9 picks up the story. It says, those who are in gloom and in darkness and distress will see a great light. And that's Jesus Christ, the man from Galilee, streaking across the sky and coming back, and then he rules the world from that time forward. The government will be upon his shoulders. And we saw how Isaiah 10 repeated the same story, and then Isaiah 11 was the millennium. So there was a secret story about Emmanuel, Jesus Christ, and the Assyrian Antichrist at the end of time, because it says, in that day I will send for the Assyrian. And that day means the day of the Lord. So is there another secret story just like this in Ezekiel chapters 7 through 11? Well, by gosh, there is. You see, I found that the entire Old Testament prophetic books, almost all of them, are about the last 3.5 years, or the time of Jacob's trouble, or the day of the Lord. Now, a lot of us have been taught that the day of the Lord is just Armageddon, or the bad stuff at the very end. But I found that throughout the Bible, it's an invasion of Israel when people say peace. And when can there be a peace at the end? No, because Jesus said at the end there'll be such a greatest time of distress that unless he comes back and cuts short those days, no life would be spared. So the only time there can be a peace is in the middle of the first 3.5 years of Daniel's final 7. And why is there a peace? Because of a peace treaty. Isaiah 28 says, you made a covenant with death, Israel. And over in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, it talks about Israel living in a false peace on the day of the Lord, which is the time of Jacob's trouble. How do I know that? Well, Jeremiah 30 verses 6 and 7 says, in that day, which is the day of the Lord, it'll be a time of Jacob's trouble. So we can deduce from that the day of the Lord is the last 3.5 years. Now, some of you may say, well, Alan, what about Joel 2:31? It says, the sun, moon, and stars are darkened before the day of the Lord. Well, the word before there might mean in the sight of, so it could be interpreted in a different way, because 20 other places in the Bible all say the day of the Lord happens when people say peace, and it's an invasion of a peaceful Israel a long time before Jesus Christ comes back with the sun, moon, and stars being darkened. Okay, so let's go to Ezekiel 7 through 11, and here we're going to also see an amazing secret story about the end of time, about the day of the Lord. In Ezekiel 7, verse 10, it says, on the day God will bring the worst of the Gentiles, the rod, to invade a peaceful Israel. Now, the rod is the name for the Antichrist in several places. Jesus also strikes the earth with the rod of his mouth. Obviously the Antichrist will imitate Jesus Christ. In Isaiah 10, it says he is the rod. So here he is the rod matching that verse in Isaiah 10, and he invades a peaceful Israel on the day of the Lord. Exactly what I said, and exactly what Paul said too. Paul said, when people are saying peace and safety, the sudden destruction of the day of the Lord will take place. That's 1 Thessalonians 5, 1 through 4. Destruction where? Israel. A peace where? Israel. And what is the major problem in the world today? A peace treaty between Muslims and the Jews, correct? One day they're going to solve this according to the Bible. And then it says this is be a day of trouble, Ezekiel 7. It'll be the day of the wrath of God, Ezekiel 7:19. And then it says, when the terror army comes, they will seek peace in vain. Again, the Muslims are a terror army, and what the Bible predicts through all of its chapters, especially Daniel 11:29 through 45, is that a Shia northern terror army will sweep through the Middle East and attack Egypt and Saudi Arabia and other Sunni nations, and they're going to then in a surprise attack Israel, which is how and why the day of the Lord happens when people say peace. Imagine, if you will, a Muslim army just marching across the desert to Israel. I think Israel would be wary of that. But the Ezekiel 38:11 says Israel will be a peaceful and unsuspecting people. Paul said, when people say peace and safety, the sudden destruction of the day of the Lord happens. And here, the day of the Lord is an invasion of a peaceful Israel that's called the day of the wrath of God. Well, it's wrath of God against Israel, as Luke 21 says. Okay? So anyway, they'll seek peace in vain. That's Ezekiel 7:25. The fugitives who escape will flee to the mountains. That's Ezekiel 7:16. And if all this sounds familiar, this is just like the New Testament. Paul said, when people say peace, the day of the Lord happens. Here it says, on the day, the worst of the Gentiles, the Antichrist would be the worst of the Gentiles, will invade a peaceful Israel. And then Isaiah 10 says he is the rod of wrath. And here in Ezekiel 7:10 it says he is the rod. And then he's the time of Jacob's trouble. Of course, when the Antichrist invades Israel, it will be a time of Jacob's trouble, and it will be a time of wrath against Israel, Luke 21:23. Okay, and then again, Jesus said, when you see this Antichrist, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. That's Matthew 24:16. Here in Ezekiel 7:16, again, the same verse, the fugitives who escape will flee to the mountains, the same act. And then what happens? Well, Jesus in Matthew 24 said, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the temple, whatever, spoken of by Daniel, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Don't even get your stuff out of your house. Why? Because Muslim armies will come back in and they'll destroy and kill even pregnant women. That's why Jesus said, what are those who are pregnant in those days? And Hosea 13:16, about the same time frame, says, pregnant women will be ripped open. They'll loot the houses. They'll do all sorts of bad things. And so that's why Ezekiel 7:25 says it's a terror army. And so the fugitives who escape will flee to the mountains, Ezekiel 7:16, and then they will defile my secret place, as Ezekiel 7:22. And so defiling the secret place is what the Antichrist does when he sets up the abomination. And amazingly, the next chapter, Ezekiel 8, says abominations in the temple. And okay, that could just be any abomination at any time, Alan, but coming on the heels of the chapter that says it's the day of the Lord when there's an invasion of peace by the worst of the Gentiles, we could link that where this Gentile defiles the secret place, Ezekiel 7:22. There's abominations in the temple, Ezekiel 8:6. And then here's an amazing scripture you probably never were taught about. An idol of jealousy is set up in the temple, Ezekiel 8:3. Okay, so again, these are all prophecies that the New Testament has about the Antichrist coming into Israel. He'll come when people say peace. He'll cause Israel to flee to the mountains. He'll set up an abomination and an idol in the temple, which Revelation 13 speaks about. And then what would happen? The Antichrist, we know, it's not said here, and it's not said in a lot of Old Testament prophecies, that we know that he'll rule for 3.5 years. It says that about 10 places in the Bible. Daniel 12. It says, how long will be till the kingdom of God comes to earth? And the angel tells Daniel it'll be about 3.5 years from the abomination. Okay, and then Revelation 11:2 says the Gentiles will trample Jerusalem for how long? 3.5 years. Revelation 12 says the Jews will flee, Israel will flee, as it says here, for how long? 3.5 years. Revelation 13, the Antichrist will rule for how long? 3.5 years. So even though all these prophecies in the Old Testament never talk about the last 3.5 years, we know it has to be there Maybe they didn't know about it. Maybe they did. If you read all these prophecies in the Old Testament, and this is precisely why the experts have missed it, because the experts in the Western mindset, we want every prophecy to have every detail about everything, and we know that it doesn't. Some prophecies don't have all the details. That's why we have to use our heads and understand that, 10 or 12 places talk about this last 3.5 years. And if you put all the pieces of the puzzle together, Israel is invaded during a peace by the worst of the Gentiles here. They flee to the mountains, as Jesus said in Matthew 24, and then he'll defile the secret place, which is what the Antichrist will do. He'll come into the temple, stop the sacrifices of the Jewish people, and he'll set up an abomination, which the same word in Ezekiel 8:6 is used, abomination in the temple. And these people, there's Jews in Ezekiel 8 who do what? They pray to the east. They pray to the sun, away from Israel. Well, Mecca's to the east, people. So anyway, and then it says, Ezekiel 8:3, an idol of jealousy is set up in the temple. And then after the Antichrist is ruled for 3.5 years, what will happen? Well, according to the book of Revelation, there's 144,000 Jews who are going to be marked on their foreheads to protect them from the wrath. And lo and behold, what does Ezekiel 9:4 say? The faithful Jews are marked on the foreheads to protect them from God's wrath. Okay? It doesn't say 144,000, but it's the same act. And then Ezekiel 10 and 11 say something remarkable. They say, the glory of God, who Jesus Christ is the glory of God, according to Isaiah 60 and 59, he is the glory of God. It leaves the temple in heaven. The glory of God comes and stands on a mountain east of Jerusalem. And we know that's Jesus Christ coming back, because Zechariah 14:4 says Jesus Christ will come back and stand on a mountain east of Jerusalem, and it'll be pierced into two. And Revelation also speaks of that. It says he'll come back and stand on a mountain. So the glory of God here coming back and stand on a mountain is Jesus Christ. And there's no doubt about it. So we see a hidden secret story here in Ezekiel 7 through 11, that Israel's going to be invaded on the day of the Lord during a false peace. It's the day of trouble. As in the time of Jacob's trouble, it's the day of wrath. As Luke 21:23 says, it's the time of punishment and wrath against Israel. Now, I love Israel. I'm not calling for it, but this is just one of those things that, the experts don't want to talk about. They want to think Israel's going to be protected from harm for all time, and some Antichrist figure like Prince William will stroll through the streets of Jerusalem and suddenly turn into an evil emperor. But that's not what it says. The real Bible says it's a Muslim army, a Gentile army will come in and terrorize Israel for 3.5 years. It's a terror army. Okay, that's what it says in Ezekiel 7:25 NIV version, which I prefer the New King James, and I use that 99% of the time, but I think it says it better there in the NIV, a terror army, which it will be, correct? And then it says, Ezekiel says it'll flee to the mountains, just like Jesus said in Matthew 24. They'll come in, this army will defile the secret place. Well, how do you know it's an army, Alan? I thought the Antichrist did this. Well, if you read in a parallel verse in Daniel 11:31, it talks about the Antichrist armed forces will come in and set up this abomination. So, no, it's not just a pope-like figure strolling through the streets of Jerusalem, suddenly changing into a bad person. That's the ouchie Bible version. No, it's, the nice person's Bible version. Anyway, I'm sorry, I messed that one up. Bad attempt at humor. He'll come in and he'll set up the abomination, and then he'll set up an idol, and then he'll the mark God after he's ruled for 3.5 years, as Revelation 11:2, Revelation 13, Revelation 12 all say, and Daniel 12. Then the faithful Jews will be marked on the foreheads to protect them from the wrath of God when Jesus comes back. And then Jesus does come back and stand on a mountain east of Jerusalem. And I hope you can see this. Now see, all the experts and scholars will say that this is all preposterous, that it all happened in the past. Ezekiel 7 happened in the past. This is all past stuff. Well, I don't think the glory of God stood on a mountain east of Jerusalem in the past, do you? And I don't think that the same exact sequence of events here in Ezekiel 7 through 11 is being mentioned as the New Testament, with even the same words and phrases about what's going to happen in the future. That there is going to be an invasion during peace, that Israel's going to have to flee, and then this guy, the worst of the Gentiles, is going to come in and defile the temple. He's going to set up an abomination, an idol of jealousy. And then God's going to mark the Jews on the foreheads at the end of the tribulation, which Revelation 7 says, and then Jesus Christ is going to come back and stand on a mountain east of Jerusalem. Now, what's so amazing about what I found here is that I found that the Bible actually repeats the same information over and over again in what I call movie flashbacks. So we just saw one version of the last 3.5 years in Ezekiel 7 through 11. And then Ezekiel 12 through 17 is what I call a movie flashback. It represents the same information to us once again. And so it says in Ezekiel 12 through 17, this vision is 4 times far off. Ezekiel 12:27. These are the days when every vision will be fulfilled. Ezekiel 12:23. Now, does that sound like every vision was fulfilled and times far off back 2,500 years ago when the experts say a lot of this stuff happened? No. Then it says, Israel will be rebellious, Ezekiel 12:2. False prophets will say, what? Peace, just like we saw before. People say peace, peace when the sudden destruction of the day of the Lord happens, Paul. And then judgments upon Jerusalem, sword and famine, Ezekiel 13:21 and 14:21. A wicked prince of Israel tries to sneak out, and he gets caught by the Antichrist armies. And then Israel will be scattered to the nations. Again, Ezekiel 12:15. You see, this is where the experts get messed up. They say, they look at all these chapters and go, Israel was scattered to the nations. That must be AD 70. But it wasn't, because it's in this prophecy is in the midst of all the end time prophecies. So you have to have context. It's called hermeneutics. It seems like the experts are trolling in Herman Munsterneutics, as far as I can tell. And then Jesus, it says, continuing on in Ezekiel 12 through 17, it goes, the Lord will give up Jerusalem. It will become desolate. Again, Jesus said that this is the abomination that causes desolation, the desolation of Jerusalem. And then Jerusalem, her lovers will burn her and leave her naked, Ezekiel 14:33. And then something amazing happens in Ezekiel 17. It says, from the highest branch a twig is placed on a high mountain. And then after God has done all this, it says, they will be my people and I will be their God. And God will establish an everlasting covenant with Israel, Ezekiel 16:60. So I hope you can see that the overall secret overarching message here in these 6 chapters is that in the end of time, and times far off, when every vision will be fulfilled, Israel will be rebellious. How will they be rebellious, Alan? Well, maybe they'll start to sacrifice again when God has once and for all given his only son as the final sacrifice. Maybe they'll start making deals with alien gods. I don't know. But for whatever reason, God's going to be upset at them. He's going to reject their sacrifices, as Isaiah 1 says, another verse that the commentaries say happened in the past. And then he's going to send an army of strangers against them, and Israel is going to try to escape, at least the leaders, and they're going to be caught by the Muslims. And then Israel will be scattered to the nations again. They're going to flee to the nations. Part of that fleeing, I believe, is an airlift by the United States, as Revelation 12 says. It says, Revelation 12, verse 14, that 2 wings of a great eagle, Israel will flee for 3.5 years. So I believe that's the United States. That's just conjecture, but it's a darn good one. And then after all this has happened, from a highest branch, a twig is placed on a high mountain. So if you place this next to the one we just looked at, the series of a sequence of events of Ezekiel 7 through 11, at the end of that sequence of events, Jesus Christ comes back and stands on a high mountain east of Jerusalem. Here, at the end of this sequence of events, a branch is placed on a high mountain. It's the same picture. Jesus is the branch throughout the entire Old Testament, and he comes back and stands on a high mountain, the Mount of Olives. Okay, people? And the Muslims will shake their fist at him and curse at him, as it says in Isaiah 8. It says they'll look up, and they'll look at the land and see darkness, stress, and gloom, and then they'll look up and curse at Jesus. And Isaiah 10 also says they'll, at the Mount of Nob, which is the Mount of Olives, they'll look up and curse at King. At least the Antichrist will curse at Jesus too. And then after all this, Ezekiel 16 says, they will be my people, and I will be their God, and God will establish an everlasting covenant with Israel. So here in Ezekiel 12 through 17, the Day of the Lord movie flashback story is seen. It's the exact same story we just saw in Ezekiel 11 through 7 through 11. And here it's just the same thing. At the end of time, there's going to be a false peace. And Jerusalem is going to be judged with sword and famine. And then they're going to be scattered to the nations again. Ezekiel 12:17. And then the Lord will give up Jerusalem. It'll be desolate, as in the abomination of desolation. And her lovers will burn her and leave her naked. This is a constant refrain in a lot of these scriptures, that Israel's lovers, or the ones the Muslims she signed a peace treaty with, will burn her and leave her naked. And then Jesus Christ, the branch, was placed on a high mountain. That's him coming back and standing on a Mount of Olives, just like at the end of the last sequence of events, Ezekiel 7 through 11. So I hope you've learned something new today. This is all new information. It's never been seen before to my knowledge. The Lord just happened to show me. I'm kind of a trailer park Christian. I'm not that bright. But I saw that there was a similar sequence of events throughout the entire Bible, that at the end of time, on the day of the Lord, during a false peace, Israel is invaded by a northern terroristic army. And this army will cause Israel to flee, another key word that the experts ignore. They don't want to know that Israel's fled out of town in the middle of the last 7 years. They're not even going to be there for the last 3.5 years for the most part. The Antichrist is going to rule there with his Muslim armies. And then there's two prophets that are going to call down the judgments of God upon the world. And this Antichrist at that time, as Revelation 11 says. But the Gentile army, Revelation 11:2, will trample Jerusalem for this last 3.5 years. And then Jesus Christ will come back, as Matthew 24:29 through 31 says. It says, after the tribulation, the sun, moon, and stars will be darkened, which is why those people will be looking at darkness and distress at the end of Isaiah 8. And they'll look up and curse. They'll look up and see Jesus Christ piercing the darkness, as Isaiah 9:1-2 says. They'll look at him and they'll shake their fist and curse at Nob, or the Mount of Olives, as Isaiah 10 says. And he'll come back and stand on the Mount of Olives. Here it says at the end of Ezekiel 17. And at the end of Ezekiel 11, it's the same story repeated in a movie flashback. And so after all this, God will establish an everlasting covenant with Israel, Ezekiel 16:60. Now I ask you, was an everlasting covenant established 2,500 years ago? No. Will it be established after Jesus Christ comes back and stands on a high mountain? Yes, it will. And amazingly enough, we see this exact same story repeated over and over and over throughout the Old Testament. One place is Zechariah 14, on the day of the Lord. Israel will be invaded. They will flee by my mountain valley. And then the Lord Jesus Christ will come back and stand on a mountain east of Jerusalem. Now again, it doesn't have there the last 3.5 years, but we know that has to happen. So again, it's the same picture repeated over and over again, which is why I call my book, The Bible is a Movie Flashback. The entire Bible, the entire Old Testament, Revelation, and New Testament pretty much is about one thing, most of it, about the time of Jacob's trouble, or the greatest time of distress the world has ever known. That starts with an invasion of a peaceful Israel. It lasts 3.5 years, as Revelation 11:2 says. And after that 3.5 years, the land will be in darkness, for the sun, moon, and stars will be darkened, and then Jesus Christ will pierce that darkness and come back in the sky. He'll stand on a mountain east of Jerusalem, as Ezekiel 7 through 11 says, and Ezekiel 17, which repeats that story. Now, isn't that amazing? You've learned something new today that, as far as I know, none of the commentaries and nobody's ever seen before. And I'm not trying to toot my own horn, because believe me, I've been beat up a lot in my life, so I don't take the credit. It's just God happened to show me this stuff, which is pretty crazy. You know, that he could show someone as dumb as me this stuff. Even my dog's over here laughing at how God could do that. It's a real miracle. If you have any questions, email me at abrook8@aol.com, and I'll be glad to answer anything. Okay? Thank you very much. Alan Brooks signing off.